It is my great delight to welcome Deborah to our program this evening. You bring a particular world, a particular perspective within this larger context of managing for sustainability.
Well, thank you so much. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here, and it's wonderful. As soon as you arrive, you really feel like you're part of a community. I really felt it coming here today, that this is a community, and that's not something you can say about a lot of places. And I think you're a very special kind of a community. You're a community of change makers, and that's an even rarer thing. So I really applaud the work to create a pioneering kind of MBA. I think it's fantastic. And it's great to be among other people who want to make change. So it's really an honor to be here. And in addition to being people who make change and think about change, I wanted to introduce you to another word that I heard recently, and it was a description of the Chief Sustainability Officer of EMC, Catherine Winkler, and a blogger wrote about her that she's a sense maker. And I thought, that's a great term, and I think that's a lot of what you do is, and what you will continue to do, to make sense of very complex institutions and problems. So I wanted to introduce that word, and I think that is really what sustainability and corporate responsibility is about, is creating change, sustainable change. So there are two words that I want you to think about as I talk and going into the future. The first one is infrastructure. What kind of infrastructure do we have for sustainability? What kind of organizations exist? And what organizations are emerging? And the other thing to keep in mind is what kind of language do we have to talk about sustainability? So those are my two general themes, and hopefully we can discuss it more as we go. So just generally the things I'll be discussing tonight, I want to give a very brief context, both in terms of how I view corporate responsibility, sustainability, and the work that I've done, and then talk about some emerging trends. And this is only meant as a beginning. I don't think these are all the trends, but I think these are some of the trends that I've seen, and I hope you'll bring up many more. It's meant kind of as a trigger of additional ideas. And I think some of them are a little bit obscure because I spent 12 years in Europe, and so maybe the trends that I've seen you may or may not have seen. So I welcome your reactions about, are these trends that you see, or they're just beginnings of trends in some cases. So I thought in some ways that's even more exciting. So what kind of things are percolating that could be impacting the landscape? And then I wanted to share a little bit with you about a new project that I'm working on, which is a sustainability lexicon, and then open it up for a very broad discussion. I wanted to begin with this. It's a book I co-wrote with a team of people in the UK, and I like to begin here for several reasons. First, I love this David Hockney painting, so that's my first reason. But I think it's also a really useful metaphor because I really think about sustainability as a journey. And I think it's useful to think in this way, both in terms of what a company's trajectory or an organization's trajectory towards sustainability is, but also your own personal growth. And the role that you could play within an organization is hopefully having a map of where you want to take the organization. And I think, in my mind, a lot of codes and standards that companies have evolved are maps, maybe rudimentary maps, but they're the beginnings of a direction. So I think it's useful to think about the metaphor of journey and map as we go forward. The other metaphor I wanted to bring up is the idea of corporate responsibility as a tool for managing complexity. And I think you can think about sustainability in the same way. To me, corporate responsibility is a small part of sustainability. And I think as the time that we live in is so complex and so uncertain that this framework of sustainability, of corporate responsibility, is a kind of prism that allows you to manage the complexity around you. And I think that's part of what makes this program so different, is that you have a lot more tools than your average MBA. And I think that's very, very exciting. So I think you can get at some of the vision and strategy and broader kind of stakeholder consultation that a lot of people don't necessarily think about in this formative phase. So I think it's helpful to think about corporate responsibility in this way. And I think it gives you an advantage over other MBAs. This is the code book that Rolf mentioned. It just came out in its second edition over the summer last year. And I think I bring it up because I think in a way it's a little bit, it's a useful way of thinking about corporate responsibility, and for me it was kind of a map also of what is the landscape. And so it kind of traces a history, and you see, for example, the OECD guidelines, which was some of the original early form of codification, all the way through environmental, social, human rights, governance, very broad range, looking at how companies manage integrity and issues around bribes. So very, very broad. And I found it very useful. I was constantly being asked, what's the difference between SA 8000 and AA 1000? And I think it's useful to be able to compare and contrast and look at it, I would say almost from a historical perspective of how these things emerged. So I think it's useful, but I also can look at it as, to some extent, a thou shalt not. You know, I think a lot of the writing of codes and standards is thou shalt not. And I think that's where we're coming from. It's not necessarily the future, but it's where we are. So SA 8000 is a document that says thou shalt not hire child labor. Thou shalt not hire forced labor. Thou shalt not discriminate. And I think a lot of codes and standards come from this orientation. And I think in many ways it's appropriate because it's a beginning. But I think it's only a beginning, and it's an important beginning. But I think in the history of corporate responsibility and sustainability, it's very early days. So it's part of this trajectory that we're on, but it's the very beginning of the journey. But it's been a very useful process and a useful book. I use it a lot. So these are some of the trends that I wanted to bring out today. And I think I really look forward to discussing with you to what extent you're aware of them, to what extent you think they're also trends or kind of pre-trends. Very generally, thinking about what infrastructure exists. And so one of the things I find very exciting is the beginning of this discussion of what is a sustainable stock exchange. I think is fascinating. And that's a discussion that's starting to happen. And just to kind of introduce some of these trends, and then we'll go into each one in more detail. And then I think the kind of picking up speed of what is a sustainable sector. So how can a sector organize itself, an industry, a commodity, to say, we want to be sustainable, we want to be responsible. What does it mean to be a responsible sector or industry? And how does that affect an individual company? How relevant is that? And what are the issues that are emerging there? Also very connected to codes and standards. And then another one that perhaps is not a trend yet, but I think it's interesting to bring up in the notion of infrastructure. So what's the relationship between trade and corporate responsibility? Trade agreements, investment agreements. Can they be part of the infrastructure? And I think it's an interesting question. And then lastly, I'm fascinated by the issue of traceability. And I think this is a key business issue that exists beyond sustainability issues, but I think it's fascinating. And I think it's something that will be of more and more importance in your careers and in thinking about supply chains. So now I'm going to take each one of these and talk about them a little bit more. Are you aware of the Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative? Only Bill? Anybody? Okay, that's interesting. Okay, so I'm glad I can share something new. To me, this is one of the most exciting things that's happening in this field. And I've been lucky to be able to follow it because I'm on an advisory board for Aviva Investors in the UK, and they're one of the, it's really their CEO who has pushed this and been kind of a key mover. And so the idea is, how can we create infrastructure? How can we put pressure on companies to do the right thing? So we can do that through stock exchanges, and that's will capture the attention of companies. So how can we get companies to think long term? And how can we get companies to promote transparency? So those are the goals. And this group of stock exchanges has met twice now. They met first in New York at the UN, and then they met again last year in China. And it's a group of stock exchanges who are having this discussion of what does it mean to be sustainable, and how can we impact the companies that are part of an exchange. And I think it's a fascinating discussion because it can really have a different flavor in different countries. And this is part of what I find fascinating about sustainability as well, is that different countries will have very different models. And what I think is particularly interesting about this is that in many cases, emerging markets are really leading the way. And I think that in and of itself is very interesting. So you see some of the countries mentioned here, Egypt, Brazil, China, not necessarily countries that you would expect to see this kind of thing happening. So it's very exciting, and some of the ways that the stock exchanges are having this discussion is to require companies to disclose, to have some kind of mandatory disclosure about their performance in ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And it's interesting that the Johannesburg Stock Exchange is the very first stock exchange to make this requirement. So all the companies listed need to move towards integrated reporting. And I think this is really radical. So I think it's great that it's happening, and I think it's great to see indices. And I think it reflects something very, very big, that I think the stock exchanges realize that they need to provide a way for investors to trust the process. And I think what's happened in the financial community, people don't trust financial institutions the way that they did. And so I think this is a recognition that environmental, social, and governance issues matter, and matter in a big way. So I think this is one of the most exciting things. And when companies say, oh, isn't this just a trend? How do you know this isn't just a fad? I say, well, this is happening at a structural level. And I think it has been intentionally quiet, because I think the stock exchanges are literally trying to get their act together. But I think it's a signal of change.
You have to point right at it.
Yes. And the other place where I see this infrastructure emerging is around industries and sectors. And this is a study that I did a couple of years ago. The very first time I did this mapping exercise, that issue was available on the Ethical Corporation website. This one is part of their strategic intelligence. It's an expensive study, but I did bring a couple copies of the summary. But again, I think this mapping is very, very interesting, because it points to this incredible change in how industries are starting to organize themselves. And there's a very broad range of the types of initiatives, and I just mentioned a couple here. I mean, there's hundreds of them, and every day it seems like there's another one. So you have the electronic industry, the automotive industry, then you have commodities. And this is something incredibly important because you have the Better Cotton Initiative, you have the Sugarcane Initiative, which just changed its name, you have coffee, you have cocoa, and I think it's, again, very, very interesting because it's going to demand structural change at the commodity exchange level. And we're starting to see that. And it gets back to the question of how do you trace something through a supply chain. So very, very interesting discussions. And then I'm sure you've heard of the Forestry Stewardship Council, the Marine Stewardship Council. The Global Social Compliance Program is a network of retailers, Walmart, Carrefour. So I think it's a very interesting thing that's happening, and it's not new in a sense because we've had responsible care for a very long time, which I know John has been involved with and is knowledgeable about. So it's not something new, but the fact that there are so many of these initiatives I think is interesting, and it gives a lot of points of leverage. Do I think they're all doing great work? No. But I think it's a new kind of organization, and I think it's something we need to watch. And I also think that many of these organizations exist under the radar. Like, they purposefully don't want to be visible. And I think it's something I would say to you, I think we need to hold these kinds of organizations accountable. And I think many of them don't get that. I think many of them are very good, but many of them don't get that they need to be transparent and accountable. And in the interviews I did with many of these organizations, I would ask them basic questions like, how much does it cost to be a member? That's classified. So if you're talking at that level, that's a very basic level of what I would call a need for transparency. So I've worked with many of these organizations. I think they have enormous power to do interesting things. And just to give an example, the International Cocoa Initiative is working to combat forced child labor in Ivory Coast and Ghana. And I think it's doing some very interesting things around, first of all, creating awareness. So why shouldn't parents sell their children into slavery? So why is that a bad thing? So community organizing at the very general level of community theater. So why is it bad to have forced child labor? And some of that needs to be done as an industry. It's hard, I think, for Nestle and Mars and others to do that on their own. So to begin to look at the very local level, in very small communities, to create change. And then also to work with commodity exchanges and to press upon the importance of the reputation of an industry. So how do you invest in the reputation of an industry? So I think there's a lot happening at this level. I think it's really interesting. And I think it's fascinating to see how many of them are growing very rapidly, but how they're having, many of them, serious problems. So I think it's an important development, but it needs to be watched, and I would love to see someone come up with kind of a scorecard for these organizations. That would be a great service to the field, because I think many of them don't get that they need to be accountable to all of us. I mean, to them, they exist only for the companies that support them. And that is not a sustainable model. Many of these organizations are facing the issue of, should they expel members who fail to live up to an industry code? And this is starting to happen. In some cases, the companies that are being kicked out are some of the companies that you would think of as the most responsible. So it's a very interesting space to watch, and I encourage all of you to follow what's happening. I think there's a lot of work to be done kind of between the sectors. And this is another piece of work that I would love to encourage all of you to get involved in, because I've done interviews with companies like Sara Lee and Unilever, and they tell me that they belong to 20 organizations like this. So cocoa, sugar, across the board. And it's very complex and duplicative to be involved in so many different initiatives. So we have a lot of work that needs to be done to kind of simplify this and to make common systems across the different sectors. So for example, could you develop common mechanisms for complaints? Because if you're a trade union official in Ghana, it's complex. What system exists in that area? So I think there's a lot of work to be done between sectors, and I think this is an area that not many organizations are thinking about. I think the retailers are thinking about it, which is interesting because obviously the retailers have to think across sectors. And then the area of trade and corporate responsibility, I think, is a very difficult area. But I wanted to highlight it because I do see something happening here. And I did a report for the UN Environment Program, which they're about to launch, that was funded by the Canadian government. And the idea was to look at trade agreements, bilateral trade agreements, regional trade agreements, and investment agreements between countries to see, is there a way in which corporate responsibility is relevant? And it wasn't sustainability, it was corporate responsibility. So that was the question. How do these connect? Do they connect? Should they connect? And so it was a fascinating project. And the conclusion is that more and more we see references to corporate responsibility in trade agreements. And where this first began to happen, the term itself, corporate responsibility, was first used in the US-Peru Free Trade Agreement and is expanded in the Canada-Peru Free Trade Agreement. So I won't get into the language itself. Anybody who's a lawyer would find it interesting. It's very tentative, very, very tentative. The Canada-Peru Free Trade Agreement actually says that there will be a committee of investments that the parties can convene that can discuss matters of corporate responsibility. So it's a very tentative way of thinking about this, but they do mention that parties should promote corporate responsibility. The parties to the agreement should promote best practice, should promote voluntary standards. So it's a beginning of a process that I think is a very long journey, but is something. I think it's a signal that we're starting to see some movement, and the report is coming out hopefully in the next couple of weeks. And I wanted to talk a little bit about traceability, which I think is very much overlooked, and I think is a key topic to think about. And the idea here is, how do you trace a product through a value chain, through a chain of custody? And I think it's an issue that many companies are struggling with, from organic to fair trade to mainstream companies. How do you trace through a very complex supply chain? And how do you get information to consumers? And do consumers care about where something is grown? And I think in this area we have a lot happening in Europe. And maybe European consumers care more. I don't know. I look forward to getting your reaction over the questions and answers. But is anybody here familiar with the Made By initiative? No? Okay, I love it when I have something new. That's good that you haven't heard about it. It's a very exciting program. It's basically what Europeans call a shadow label. So it's a label that garment companies use, and it's a lot of high fashion using this. So it's basically a little blue button that goes on garments that have this kind of higher standard. And it's a way for companies, mainly Dutch, but it's broadening. And I think it's an interesting example because what they have done is each garment has a number, and then you as a consumer can plug in that number on a website and find out where was the cotton grown to make your shirt. Sorry, yes?
That's just similar to what we're doing in the U.S. though, in regards to milk. They have a lot of dairy products now have codes that you can type into the computer. Is that a similar premise?
It's the same kind of idea. I think this one's, and I think that this will be coming more and more because I think consumers do care, and I think it's interesting. And the made by example, they combine, what's different about it, and what I find exciting is that they actually combine organic and socially responsible. So it's kind of, it's an innovative thing, and so for a garment, you can plug in the number on the t-shirt or the jeans or the belt and find out where the raw material comes from. So the cotton is organically grown, and you see where it comes from. Where was it grown, and you see what kind of organic certification that comes from, and then you see from the social side and the working conditions, you actually see the individual worker that made the garment. And they have different standards that they use. They use SA 8000, they use a Dutch program called Fair Wear. There are different things that you can use and you can select. But you can see the actual worker, and you can see the actual place in the world where the cotton comes from, the silk comes from. And so I think it's very exciting, and there are some other cotton companies that are starting to do this around t-shirts. And it's obviously it's easier to do it for a t-shirt than it is to do for an iPhone. But I think it's an interesting beginning, and it raises these questions. How do you guarantee that a product is moving through the supply chain the way that you think it is? And another really interesting project that I've been involved with is a Human Rights Dilemmas Forum. And you can access this on the UN Global Compact website. And the idea here is that one of the case studies that we looked at is cotton from Uzbekistan. And so they have the same issue. How do you guarantee that cotton, many companies have pledged not to use cotton from Uzbekistan because of the use of forced labor, of children, of people across the board. So how do you trace your cotton through a supply chain if you're Macy's or you're Timberland? And I think it's a really tough one. And in that case, where the Uzbek government refuses to make change, the commodities will play a pivotal role. But again, how do you trace cotton through a commodity exchange? Very, very tough questions. But I like this example because I think it's creative and it's kind of fun for consumers to look at this. Okay, so those are some of the trends that I wanted to share with you, and you know, I may have a different perspective having lived so long in Europe, so that it'll be interesting to see to what extent you see these trends here in the US and in other places. But one of the projects that I'm getting involved in now, and it's really just beginning, is around language and looking at emerging vocabulary in sustainability. And I think it's a very exciting area. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about the origins of where the project came from, because I think it's very telling. I'm advising a project that Forum for the Future has a project that looks at what would a sustainable economy look like in 2040. And it's a fascinating study which they'll launch in the spring. And it's incredible. They do amazing work. And my reaction to them when I heard about the study is, we don't have vocabulary to even discuss what 2040 will look like. And as I said that, I thought, okay, this is the kind of work that I would like to do. What vocabulary exists and what vocabulary do we need that we don't have to get to a sustainable 2040? And so I'm working with a team of great people, and I've had incredible response on this, to create a wiki that would be basically generate the lexicon through crowdsourcing. So people can put up definitions, people can put up ideas. And I wanted to say it's not about jargon. You know, I think a lot of people think, oh, okay, this is about jargon. It's not about jargon. And I think a lot of companies and individuals use a lot of sustainability speak or corporate responsibility speak in a way that's not helpful. And I want to stress that this is not what this is about. It's not about jargon, but it's about what concepts exist for which we don't have language. And I want to kind of work on definitions across the board. And I was involved in a corporate responsibility dictionary that's very good. But again, it looks at existing terms, but what terms do we need that we don't have? So this is the kind of interesting place that I'm starting to inhabit. And I find it really interesting because I find that almost every day I'm learning new words for ideas that you will all recognize, but you don't have the vocabulary yet. So the idea is that this would be an evolving process. So kind of like sustainability itself, it's a journey. It would live online, but would be published in different intervals. So one of the ideas is to have like a Lexicon 1.0, 2.0, that we would launch the first one at Rio Plus 20 next year. So that is the kind of vision of it. And again, it's still in its early days, but I view sustainability as very broad. So I would include a very wide range of issues, both social, environmental, and health. And one of the really useful pieces of feedback that I got from companies on this is that companies say to me, this is so useful because not only can we talk to the sustainability world, but we can talk to the rest of the world, and they could understand us. So not only in our small world, but we could talk to financial people, we could talk to technology people, and we could understand where our language is different. And sometimes we have the same word in CSR or sustainability as the financial community, like materiality. So how is that different in different spheres? And I think it will be enormously useful. And I hope we can get John's definition of sustainability in there. And the idea is also to see how language evolves. So what did it mean and what does it mean now? So hopefully it's a way of getting rid of jargon and greenwashing, and to really encourage companies to make statements using terminology that is grounded in a common understanding. So I think the process itself will be very helpful, and we want to give credit to where do the terms come from, which I think is interesting. So I wanted to just share with you some of the words, you know, that we're coming across. So some of them we hear a lot: water risk, climate risk, but how do we define it? And food security was one that Oxfam shared with me. Biocapacity is a word I find really interesting, looking at the ability of a country or region to generate agricultural output. So Brazil has a greater biocapacity than Japan. And again, it's useful in thinking about this. My friends from the world of health suggested the word syndemic, and I think it's very, very interesting. It's the incidence, the coincidence of two diseases. So the likelihood, for example, that someone would have HIV/AIDS and hepatitis are syndemic. So I think, again, it's useful vocabulary to think about how do we address global health? How do we address poverty? And then one of my favorites, this is from Catherine Winkler at EMC. coined this term de-waste, which is basically data that's waste, that we store and that we don't need. And I think it's a great term. And I hope all of you have some terms like this, that we know what it is, but we hadn't heard the term before. Framework agreement is, has anybody heard of it? Any of the Europeans? I think it's one of the most interesting things happening in the area of corporate responsibility. And it's not that well known, surprisingly. But it is, I think, more of a European trend. So that's the, many companies in Europe have set up an agreement between the company and their global trade union. So it's a code of conduct that's basically, it's based on the conventions of the International Labor Organization. It's nothing new, but it gives the trade union at a national level the ability to say, but hang on, you made an agreement at the global level, which there's a lot more power in Brussels than there is in remote Guatemala. So I think the only American company to have it is Chiquita. It's mainly a European phenomenon. Danone has one. A lot of Scandinavian companies have it. But Chiquita has told me that of all the initiatives that they participate in, Ethical Trading Initiative, SA 8000, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that having a framework agreement is the most powerful tool that they have, because they have to sit down at the local level several times a year and have a conversation about trade union rights. And if they didn't have the pressure at the global level, they wouldn't have that power at the local level. So I think it's, again, really, really interesting, but we don't know about it. Multi-stakeholder, what does it mean? It means different things to different organizations, and this is one of the key problems of the sector initiatives, that many of them say, we're multi-stakeholder. What does that mean? That you know who your stakeholders are? That you talk to them once a year? What does it mean? Do you just talk to them or do you listen? So again, crafting definitions, so at least we have a common language, a common lexicon. And waste to value is another term that I heard recently that I thought was really helpful. So I hope that you have terms that you would put forward either on a wiki or in conversation here. And I really look forward to your ideas about this, because we're just getting started. So it's an interesting project. I wanted to share with you my contact details, and please feel free to contact me. My friends joke that I should be a headhunter because I'm always networking people, and happy to be helpful. So let me stop there because I feel like I've been talking for a really long time, and open it up for questions. Comments? Yes?
Where does this wiki currently live? Is it published, or?
It's in the process of being developed, and so hopefully in the next month or so we can answer that. But it's something that's evolving, and the idea is to make sure that it happens in a really good way, because I think the way that it evolves is really important, and it has to be accessible, it has to be open, it has to be credible. So the emphasis right now is on finding the right kinds of sponsors, the right kinds of technology that make it really accessible. And there's so many tough questions. One of the questions, for example, is, do you just work in English? Wiki has completely different content in different languages. I mean, and it's a very difficult question. I welcome feedback from you. I think it should have different languages should have their own lexicon. But then I hear from a lot of the companies I work with in Latin America that no, we use English. We talk about marketing. We talk about terms in English. So it's really difficult. So I want to get a lot of those kinds of questions right before we start. But I will certainly pass on to all of you once it's up and running. Yes, John.
You mentioned that this Peru, that the corporate responsibility in the trade agreements. Can you, and you said, well, it's in flux and so forth, but I'd be really curious if you could flesh out some of the specifics about what language is corporate responsibility showing up in that process.
Yes. I think the way that it will manifest will be very similar to the OECD guidelines, in which it becomes possible to make a complaint. And so I think this is not a very proactive way of managing change, waiting for complaints. And this is the way that the OECD guidelines work, for example. But I have examples of some of the language with me, you know, to kind of share. It's very much UN kind of language. It's very tentative. But I can quote, you know, more from it. But it's still very rudimentary. But what excites me is that there are actual fora being created. So that I think is positive. But the language itself is still very, very tentative. Let me see if I can find the actual language. Let me take another question while I just...
Let me just add to that.
Yes.
What I'm really asking is, where do you go for positive definitions, positive meanings, manifestations of corporate responsibility? Almost everything you've said are restrictive, regulatory in nature.
Right, right. That's a very good question, and I'm hoping that the lexicon will be able to take us there, because I think when you begin to create new language, you begin to open up new possibilities. And I just was listening to your class, and I think this is about consciousness. This is about creating a new consciousness, and we don't have the language and experiences to do that yet. And so I think the codes are a very crude effort to create change in very incremental and safe ways. But it's not fully meaningful. So I think it's only step one, and I think they're very legalistic. They're many times drafted by lawyers. They're not easy to interpret. There's a lot of fig leaves, and I'll share with you what the kind of language that I mean. So, in the preamble to the Canada-Peru agreement, each country should encourage enterprises operating in their territory to respect internationally recognized corporate social responsibility standards and principles and pursue best practice. So very aspirational, but it does create this Committee on Investment, which again, I think is a useful forum. So you have a chance, again, the committee shall meet at such times as agreed by the parties, so that could be never, and facilitate joint initiatives. So I think which may address issues such as corporate social responsibility and investment facilitation. So again, it's the degree to which this language is starting to emerge. And I think it's progress because it wasn't there before in trade agreements, and so it's now there. But is it enough? No. I think it's really a baby step. And perhaps it's not even the right vehicle. But I do see, again, very negative ways that this is coming up. So a lot of the discussion that we have is around arbitration. So how do you arbitrate conflict? Is that the helpful discussion? No. I mean, it's helpful because we have conflict, but should we be preventing conflict and creating new ways of working? So I think it's very much still a legal question. How do we solve conflict? Where do we complain? And it's not about changing the system. And I think that is where language is very helpful, because it begins to ask questions and develop ideas that we can't express yet. Yes?
Companies like Procter & Gamble and Walmart are coming out with sustainability scorecards, and there's a lot of variability with how those are enforced or what they're asking, and also how they measure their baselines and goals. And I'm wondering what frameworks exist out there that companies maybe outside the U.S. have already adopted for those types of...
That's a great question, and I think one of the really interesting trends I see coming out of Europe, and I think it will continue here. I think, I hope so. One of the interesting developments is we have in Europe, we use something called human rights impact assessment. And I think this is something that European companies are doing more and more. And one of the projects that I helped as an advisor is the Danish program, the Danish Institute for Human Rights. Great initiative around human rights impact assessment. So I think that's very much the cutting edge. Being Danes, they don't go around bragging about it. So it's not well known, but it's really a template for how you do this and how you measure a company's impact on human rights. So I think that's a very useful thing. I think scorecards are very rudimentary. Human rights is very complex, and journalists ask me all the time, what's a good company? What's a bad company? You know, there's no good company and bad company. All the companies are on a journey, and Walmart might be doing something positive in one area and still be Neanderthal in another. So it's very hard. And John and I were discussing earlier the question of overconsumption. You know, how can a company scorecard measure the degree to which a company is leading consumers to overconsume? So I think scorecards are kind of like these trade agreements. It's very small steps towards something, and I think it's laudable, but it's too small to hold the concept of sustainability. In the back.
I kind of have a two-part question. Is it that the existing scorecards address the problem on too base a level, or is trying to bottle sustainability or package it and say, here's the scorecard, you comply by this and we're good? Which is it?
I think it's two things. I think to be credible and meaningful, sustainability has to really embrace complexity. It has to hold the complexity. And while simplification is good in kind of early phase, I think it misses the big picture, which is basically what sustainability is. So I think it's a step in the right direction, just like reporting is a step in the right direction. But what I want to know is, what is the company's strategy for achieving sustainability? What does sustainability mean to the company? And these are the kinds of things that companies, socially responsible investment companies like Aviva and others, are trying to get as part of listing requirements for a stock exchange. So that's much more interesting, I think. What's the strategy? Are there products that you're going to phase out because they're not sustainable? How do you view your company in 10 years? That's much more interesting. What are the dilemmas that you face? Those real questions, I think, make this, do justice to this field. So again, it's very complex, and consumers don't want to read 200 pages. But I think the lexicon will help companies to report and communicate in interesting ways. And that is, how do these new terms relate to what we're doing and to our identity and to our brand? How does our brand connect to sustainability, and not just in simple PR terms? Does that help?
Yeah, that leads me right into the second part of what I wanted to ask, which was, you had mentioned earlier that with all these organizations that people are, that companies are joining, some have been kind of asked to leave.
Yes.
Because of certain things, and I was wondering if you could address that with some anecdotal
Sure.
stuff.
Sure. It's fascinating. Again, wonderful report topic. If anyone's looking for a paper, fascinating, very below the radar, great blog here. It's really interesting. So I think a lot of initiatives have been very courageous in doing this. So I'll give you a couple examples. Global Compact, they're not exactly an industry initiative, but I think they have delisted a lot of companies. And in, I think, a relatively public way. So that was a kind of mass cutting off of the bottom.
Just what's the global compact?
Okay, sorry.
I'm not sure.
The UN Global Compact was founded by Kofi Annan and is a kind of statement of 10 principles for corporate responsibility. So very basic, the labor principles, environmental principles, the very basic common denominators, and then they added integrity as their 10th. So it's kind of the most basic statement you could come up with. But it has a lot of people adhering to it. A lot of companies sign up to it, but then never do anything. So they have removed a lot of companies. And I think one of the most interesting ones is the Ethical Trading Initiative in the UK, and that's become more global. They actually asked Levi Strauss & Company to leave, which I think, you know, is just amazing, because one of the principles of the Ethical Trading Initiative is that you should not, you should have a statement about paying a living wage. And Levi Strauss & Company says, that's not possible. That's not realistic. What is a living wage? If you tell us what a living wage is, we'll pay it. But what is a living wage and how is it defined? If we can't adhere to something that we can't define. So it's a really tough, it's really challenging. And I kind of see both sides of it. I mean, I could see where the Ethical Trading Initiative is coming from, but if there's a company that you don't want to attack, it's Levi Strauss. Attack a lot of the companies that aren't even in the Ethical Trading Initiative. So very hard, and there's a lot of discussion. And my opinion is that the threat of expulsion is actually more interesting than the actual expulsion. And you have it in the soy. There's a lot of controversy in the Responsible Soy Initiative, responsible sourcing, anyway, it's an acronym, but so I think the threat of expulsion is very powerful. And almost, once they're expelled, it's almost too late because then you've lost them. So I think, you know, having a credible threat, you have to do it once in a while. And a lot of organizations are doing that. But again, we don't know, people don't know about it. And we have to kind of explain to the initiatives that they are operating on a global stage and they need to broadcast what they do and how they do it.